we've got company. Okay, here's the plan. We need to get out of here now. If we take out those intruders, the security doors will unlock.
The original Sin and Punishment released in Japan on November 21st, 2000 as a Japanese-only title for the Nintendo 64 to positive reception. Since then, multiple new consoles would have hit the scene, creating easily the best generation of all time, known as Generation 6. New IPs were being created under Nintendo like Pikmin, Golden Sun, Advance Wars, Battalion Wars, Chibi Robo, Eternal Darkness, and so on, further expanding Nintendo's first-party catalog. And a lot of Nintendo franchises were being taken in some pretty interesting directions, to say the least. It was a very experimental generation for Nintendo software, and that no doubt plays a big role into why I love this generation of Nintendo so much. But with so much going on with other Nintendo games, unfortunately, Sin and Punishment was nowhere to be seen on the Nintendo GameCube. Even a game like Custom Robo, an obscure Nintendo game about action figures essentially fighting each other on virtual battlefields that saw 2 releases in Japan only during the Nintendo 64 generation, received a brand new game on the GameCube with Custom Robo Battle Revolution in 2004. And what a game it was. But still, no Sin and Punishment. During this time, Treasure, the original developer behind Sin and Punishment, was working on other games, the most notable of which during this time being Ikaruga. But they also had titles like Gradius V, Sylph Heat, The Lost Planet, and Stretch Panic for the PlayStation 2, Tiny Toon Adventures, Buster's Bad Dreams, Hajime no Ippo the Fighting, Astro Boy Omega Factor, Advanced Guardian Heroes, and Gunstar Superheroes for the Game Boy Advance, Dragon Drive, D Master's Shot, and Wario World for the Nintendo GameCube. There was even a canceled fighting game by the name of Tiny Toon Adventures, Defenders of the Universe for the PlayStation 2 and the GameCube. Sin and Punishment just wasn't a priority at this time, and their hands were full with other projects. That is, until the 6th generation came to a close and Nintendo began to set the industry on fire with their brand new motion-controlled console, the Nintendo Wii. Released on November 19th, 2006, the Nintendo Wii was a massive success for Nintendo, selling over 100 million units worldwide, with a great library of games from both first-party and third-party developers. It was Nintendo's 7th generation console that featured the Wii Remote as its primary controller, a controller that allowed for motion-controlled gaming that could recognize gesture movement and could be used as a more traditional controller by tilting it sideways, often used for 2D platformers. And by plugging in the nunchuck attachment, it allowed for more buttons as well as analog movement. Where it truly shined was when it could be used as a pointing device. When the original Sin and Punishment came out in 2000, Nintendo was working on a movement device that Treasure considered using. Now that Nintendo has officially released such a controller, now seemed like the perfect time to bring back the series. The only Sin and Punishment sighting we would end up getting after the year 2000 would be in Super Smash Bros. Brawl in 2008, when Saki Amamaya, the main protagonist of the first game, would get to be an assist trophy as well as getting a brief description of his character. On October 2nd, 2008, Nintendo held a press conference in Japan where they announced upcoming titles for the Nintendo DS, an upgraded Nintendo DS called the Nintendo DSi, and upcoming titles for the Nintendo Wii, such as a sequel to Endless Ocean, a remake of Punch-Out!, Trace Memory Wii, and finally, after 8 years of silence, a sequel to Sin and Punishment 64, simply titled Sin and Punishment 2. In an Iwata Asks interview with other members of Treasure that worked on Star Successor, Mr. Satoru Iwata reveals that he and Yamagami have been talking about making a Sin and Punishment game for the Wii for a while. Maegawa submitted the proposal to Yamagami, expecting to hear back from him months later, since that's how long these things typically take. Yamagami was really pleased with the proposal, but didn't get to discuss it with Mr. Iwata until 3 days later, in which Mr. Iwata replied, "If I'd been able to meet with Yamagami-san the same day it arrived, I would have approved it that very day." Treasure wanted to do a Wii game for Sin and Punishment since they had the type of point and click control they originally wanted with Sin and Punishment 64, which was the Wiimote. Maegawa states, "The weapon that appears in this game is called a cannon sword. It's a gun and a sword, so slashing and shooting are the basic operations. We thought the Wii Remote was perfectly suited to those actions. I thought you could aim the Wii Remote and use the nunchuck to move the player character, so I started bugging these two about using that method for a Sin and Punishment sequel." They stated they had more to do before starting development. They reached out to Yasushi Suzuki, who had been the illustrator for Sin and Punishment and Ikaruga, and requested that he do the illustrations for Star Successor, even though he no longer worked at Treasure. Maegawa stating, "When you change designers, the style changes, resulting in a very different game. That was something we couldn't let happen. They gave him complete creative freedom with his artwork and just told him to draw whatever he wants." Yuri Hattori from Nintendo, most notable for being the director of Style Savvy, volunteered to work on the project as well. She was initially fascinated by the art on the packaging, the game's world, and what people around her were saying. Hattori's input on Star Successor consisted of difficulty and making the game more approachable, as well as designing the game's tutorial. But due to the fact that for any game that requires pointing on Wii, it gives the players more of an advantage due to the faster movement of motion controls in comparison to the much slower analog sticks in regards to aiming. Fun fact, the pointer on the Wii is also the reason why to this day, Nintendo fans demand that shooters that make their way to Nintendo home consoles have a pointer or gyro feature. Once you get used to it, it really highlights just how much analog actually weighs you down. The motion controls made the overall difficulty of Sin and Punishment Star Successor way too easy. It was so easy that Hattori was able to clear the game without dying once. Even Nintendo made a comment stating, "It's too easy. What's the deal?" Fans would never approve of something so easy, and demanded that they give the game a much higher difficulty, since that is what Treasure games are notorious for, which was a surprise since they wanted the original Sin and Punishment difficulty lowered back on the Nintendo 64. In the end, they were able to balance the game to where each controller option performs better in certain areas. Sin and Punishment Star Successor lets you take control of two playable characters, Issa Joe and Kachi. It's an on-rail shooting game where the goal of the game is to cut, shoot, and dodge every enemy and obstacle in your path, with some differences that set it apart from its prequel. The most immediate noticeable difference is that Star Successor focuses on flight, whereas 64 was more of a ground-based shooter. Issa uses a hover pack, and Kachi uses a flight board to get across the levels when in the air, in which the whole screen can be used to evade enemies. A very cool addition. Even while airborne, you have the ability to dodge projectiles with some nice added invincibility frames, allowing you to slip by, and it never feels as though it takes away from the challenge. It's really cool when you enter this state and your brain places more emphasis on the background and just focusing on that, while your character is more of a secondary thing. It's hard to explain until you play it for yourself. You can still slice enemies with your beam sword or melee attack with Kachi to either deal damage with a 1 to 3 hit combo or reflect enemy projectiles by aiming your Wiimote where you would like to reflect and then attacking the projectile. If you've played the original game, you'll notice that the beam saber in that game was a lot faster and really didn't have much recovery frames to using it. After the third hit here, there are some recovery frames that will leave you vulnerable, so deciding between if you want to attack once, twice, or 3 times is important here. The main thing that separates Issa and Kachi as playable characters is that Issa is more of a manual character, while Kachi locks onto enemies. As well as their special attacks, Issa will have the player focus more on actually aiming at the enemy while focusing on the projectiles coming his way, and his special attack is a heavy damage charge shot that will cover a large portion of the screen. Kachi locks onto enemies, which allows you to focus almost entirely on what's happening on the screen while not having to worry if your attacks are landing. Her special attack is launching homing shots on enemies that are targeted. I wouldn't say that either character is better or worse, it mainly depends on what you prefer, as I think they are both balanced between each other very well. Star Successor features a co-op mode, where another player can play as a reticle and assist with shooting enemies on the screen. Unfortunately, there is no option to play as another character and fly around, dodge, and slash enemies with player 1. Could be due to hardware limitations, or they felt like having an additional character would either hurt performance or visibility on screen. Star Successor is a much longer game than the first title. You could beat the first game in roughly 1 hour, whereas part 2 comes in around 6 to 7 hours for one playthrough. You'll travel through a total of 8 stages, all with their distinct look to them, and I must say, this is one beautiful game. I've always been a fan of that Gen 6 look, and with how much is happening on screen, added with nice performance and great art direction, it really is one of the Wii's most beautiful titles. Big shout out to Treasure. It's always a joy to revisit this title. The Nintendo 64 game visually was not the best, though it did have some impressive background moments, but I really like what they accomplished here all across the board. Sin and Punishment Star Successor's storyline may come across as confusing at first, or that you simply won't care what's going on because you want to get back to the action. The reason for this is because Star Successor, it does things old school. The character background and prologue are actually told through the manual, which sets the stage for this entire game. Honestly, it is really cool, and it made me appreciate the game much more once I read it and was able to put the pieces together as to what was going on. Because certain things in the game just never made sense at first, like being impaled by a giant pole and then twisting yourself out of it, or falling into lava and being completely fine. But now that I have more context, it really brings the story together nicely. There exist 2 different dimensions in this universe known as inner space and outer space, and there is a power struggle going on between the two. In order to combat against outer space, inner space has created multiple Earths to essentially grow humans and turn them into aggressive soldiers that will do their biddings to attack outer space. However, due to the emotional instability of humans and having their own minds, there comes a time when they don't want to fight anymore and instead wish for peace. Once humans start losing their aggressive nature and long for everlasting peace, the creators of inner space wipe out the Earth and then create another Earth to once again raise aggressive humans to take on outer space. Due to the defensive front line of inner space being vulnerable, this gives outer space the chance to attack. Outer space sends a recon unit disguised as a human girl with a tail to Earth 4, where this game takes place, to try and get some intel on humans and their weaknesses. During Kachi's trip to Earth 4, she ends up losing her memory and reasoning for being there in the first place. However, she is still very curious about humans.
What is human?
Humanity is hard to define, but we have a head with 2 ears and 2 eyes.
And a nose and a mouth?
Yep.
And a body with 2 arms?
That's right.
And 2 legs, right?
Uh-huh.
Oh, and a tail.
Sure. We don't have tails.
Inner Space finds out about the infiltration and decides to send Issa Joe, son of the protagonist Saki Amamiya and Iron Joe from the first game, to destroy the spy. A lot of the high-ranking officers of Inner Space aren't happy with the decision, since Issa isn't entirely human, as he possesses the DNA that his father had, which caused him to transform into a ruffian in the first game after he fell into a pit of blood, in which Saki began losing control and attacking everything in his path. It wasn't until Iron entered his body and recovered his humanity that he started to regain control of himself again. Due to having mixed blood, Issa received a lot of hatred and discrimination from other humans for not being pure-blooded. Issa makes his way to Earth 4 to eliminate Kachi, but upon arrival, he doesn't see her as a threat. He sees an innocent girl that is just curious about humans. She's also not human and is an outsider, which causes Issa to form a connection with her because of relatability and decides not to carry out his mission. Inner Earth looks at Issa's unwillingness to kill Kachi as betrayal and begins sending humans from Earth 5, their most recent Earth, to eliminate them both, as well as an elite group of 5 human warriors known as the Nebulox to take them down. The Nebulox accept the mission on grounds that the Inner Earth creators give more rights to the people of Earth 5. And so the game begins. You'll take on humans, aliens, and the Nebulox, or G5 if you're playing the Japanese version, and defeating them one by one. Not much is really added to their time on screen outside of asking why Issa hasn't carried out his mission. One major thing that happens in the story is that we get a glimpse of ruffian form Saki in 2017 on a rampage like we did in Sin and Punishment 64 that shows him to be in what seems to be New York City, which is where he said he wanted to go at the end of the first game to be a cop. During this flashback, Issa begins having a conversation with his mother about if becoming a monster will be his fate as well.
Mama, when I grow up, am I gonna be a monster like Daddy?
Well, Issa, that's up to you. Only you can decide how to use the power inside you. Look into your heart and use that power for what is right. But don't let anyone else decide what's right or wrong for you. Someday, you'll find a companion to help shoulder your burden.
A companion?
That's right, love. And don't forget, Daddy's not a monster, okay? Daddy's just Daddy.
He admits that Kachi is the person that he's been looking for this whole time, and that she is that special someone to him, much like Iron was for Saki, and he vows to protect her at all cost, which then transforms him into a ruffian with Kachi inside of him. A nice little callback to Saki's transformation. After turning into a monster with great ability, you go to outer space to destroy the orbital satellite and put an end to the Nebulox once and for all before they destroy the Earth again. Kachi's soul ends up getting detached from Issa's body, so the final boss has you deflecting and shooting the enemy before Kachi is killed. And then you finally end up beating the boss, in which he'll say,
"Your allegiance to that monster will destroy this entire universe."
There's only one monster here. And that's you, Deku! Kachi. She's just Kachi.
And that's the end of the game. For now. To get the true ending, you'll have to beat the game with both Issa and Kachi separately, which will then unlock Issa and Kachi mode, a mode that allows you to swap between both of the characters with the push of a button. And upon beating Issa and Kachi mode, you're giving an extended ending after beating Deko, the final boss.
Issa, I'm beginning to remember details about my past.
Oh yeah? Like what?
Long ago, I wasn't called Kachi. I was known as Achi.
So basically, Achi, who was the main villain from Sin and Punishment 64, is the person that Issa ends up falling in love with and helping out this entire game. Meaning that Issa trying to protect Achi from the Nebulox was a mistake, at least depending on what side you decide to look at it from. The creators of Inner Space aren't exactly saints. They wiped out entire planets simply because humans started having their own free will and no longer wanted to fight, but instead live in peace. And let's just say, for the sake of argument, that Achi really did have amnesia and didn't manipulate Issa. It would still make sense for Issa, based on the teachings of his mother of following his heart, as well as the life he's lived being treated as an outcast and a monster from the very ones he's supposed to be following orders from, to not want to side with inner space. Who's to say he didn't already have these same worldviews as Achi due to his own discriminatory experiences, so maybe he wouldn't need to be manipulated regardless. Anyways, Achi won. She got her God of War that she wanted Saki to be for her in the first game, but sadly, that's where this story ends, which has left fans speculating as to where the story could go from here. Would Issa continue to follow his heart and protect Achi? Has anyone even told him who Achi is? And without knowledge of knowing who she is, continue to stand by her side? Or is his hatred for Inner Earth stronger than that? Will Achi go back to Earth to try and take revenge on Saki and Iron, with Issa as her groomed soldier by her side? Where even is Issa and Iron? Are they alive or are they dead? Who knows, but that's the cliffhanger Star Successor has left us with for over a decade now, and hopefully we'll get our answer someday.
Is it all over?
Yeah.
So what now? Head back to Earth and hide there?
No more hiding, Kachi. No more running. We forge ahead now.
That sounds nice.
They'll eventually come after us, but I don't care, because we've got each other. Together, we can take on anyone.
The game released in Japan on October 29th, 2009, May 7th, 2010 in Europe, and June 27th, 2010 in North America, and received positive reviews, holding an 87 out of 100 on Metacritic and an 85.86% on Game Rankings. IGN UK praised it, giving it a 9.2 out of 10, and writing, "Forget bullet hell, Treasure has created an awesome slice of bullet heaven." IGN US gave it a 9 out of 10 and an Editor's Choice Award, writing, "Playing Sin and Punishment Star Successor is like diving into an action movie full of amazing sights and tense gunfights." Treasure would go on to make Bangai O HD, Missile Fury for the Xbox 360 in 2011, and 2 Geist Crusher games, one in 2013 and one in 2014 for the Nintendo 3DS. But that's pretty much been it as far as new releases for the company. I don't know what the fate is for the studio, and I don't know what the fate is for the series. Whatever the case, I am glad that both of these games exist, that they are very good, and that I had a chance to experience them. Sorry that this video took so long to get out, but thank you for all the comments over the years showing interest in a part 2. It can be a little discouraging putting in so much time and effort into such a niche game that many people won't show up for, but still, it's those comments from the community that appreciate the more obscure videos that keep me going. Anyways, thanks again. I'll catch you all on the next video. Take care. Have a good one.